Joining us now for updates in the Keystone State and the looming court battles that may be on the way is Jenna Ellis, the senior legal advisor to the Trump campaign. So Jenna, first I want to get your input on what's happening in Pennsylvania right now. We know that really the path to victory, it runs through a couple states, Arizona being one of them, but Pennsylvania also being a very pivotal one. So from what you're seeing right now, what's your reaction?
Yeah, well, we've been seeing things on the ground that are very concerning. So, first of all, what happened this morning was that the Pennsylvania Appellate Court judge issued a ruling that allowed Team Trump to have meaningful access to be able to observe the ballot counting. That's the law. We should be able to do that. And of course, that's just transparency. And so, of course, the Biden camp should also be able to observe. We're all in favor of free and fair elections, right? Well, what's happening as Pam Bondi has reported is that what happened is they've moved the fence for the observers 6 feet closer to the ballot counters, but then moved the ballot counters 6 feet further away. So, of course, that's not actually in compliance with the court's order. So we're going to have to challenge that yet again and the response to that lawsuit. But also what's going on in Pennsylvania, Alex, is a filing of intervention to add the Trump campaign as a plaintiff in the pending action before the Supreme Court. Remember that Article 2 says of the U.S. Constitution says that only state legislatures can govern the law, the election law that will determine the manner in which state electors are chosen. What's happened in Pennsylvania is their state legislature has not acted. It's only been their governor and other executive branch officials that have tried to change the law and allow that 3-day late period to accept ballots for counting. That's unconstitutional in every way. And so we're hoping that the Supreme Court will take up that case and will fairly and appropriately apply the Constitution and make sure that every legal vote counts, not the illegal and late votes.
And so there is a question that I have about that procedurally. A lot of people are, of course, knowing that at some point we need to know who the president is going to be. So a lot of people are asking if this is going to be something that is expedited, super quick. How does this work? So I'm assuming you won't have to go then to an appellate court. It'll go straight to the Supreme Court. Is that how something like this would work?
Well, so that action in terms of the 3-day extension period, that's already pending before the Supreme Court. And we actually asked even before Election Day for the Supreme Court to take that up. They declined to. And Justice Alito said in his dissent, we're basically just kicking this down the road after the election. And he was, of course, entirely right. So typically, the court does know, like we saw in the year 2000 when Bush v. Gore went up to the Supreme Court, that the court understands, some of these deadlines and the constitutional parameters. The Electoral College will vote on December 14th, so that's the first really critical deadline. But ultimately, for the constitutional purposes, the president is sworn in, whoever that is, on January 20th at noon 2021. So we still have a few weeks, even though I know the American people, myself included, really want a resolution, but we want a legitimate resolution to the outcome here.
And just to contextualize that, too, I mean, even Bush v. Gore, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't decided until December. I mean, this is not necessarily a unprecedented situation or anything like that. It hasn't happened very often. But when we look at Pennsylvania, it looks like it's going to come down to a couple thousand votes. And that seems to be the situation that we're seeing in places like Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona as well. So when it comes to this legal battle, do those all get enjoined into the same type of decision that would ever come down by the Supreme Court? Or is that something they'd have to look at on an individual basis?
Well, it depends on what the legal challenge is. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, the court has ordered segregation of the ballots. But why that meaningful access to observe is so important is that we're hearing reports of mixing in ballots that were late into the ones that were received timely. And so we have to make sure that those are segregated so that when there is that legal challenge, if the court does find that any votes, whether it's for Trump, whether it's for Biden, whether it's for a write-in or anyone else, anything that was received after the deadline on Election Day, we know which ballots those are, and those cannot be part of the count.
That is really interesting because, for example, when we see the numbers coming in, it does matter if they're the votes that were cast on Election Day, because we know those are breaking for President Trump in greater numbers as compared to those that are coming in through the mail or those that possibly could have come in after Election Day. We are seeing that those are breaking more so for the Biden campaign. So is the process to separate those two so we can decide, or not us, but the Supreme Court decide that which ones are valid and then which ones should be separated from the ultimate vote count? Is that the right way to put this?
Yeah, and so that's why the ballot segregation in terms of when they were received, whether it was before the deadline, and then those ballots, of course, have to be looked at and say, are they duplicative? Are they residents? Do they meet all the criteria of a legal ballot? And so, of course, they would meet the legal criteria of the deadline. So that's one method of challenge. Those are a different pile than the ones that are segregated to say, well, they don't even meet the threshold legal challenge and the threshold a legitimacy challenge of coming in after the deadline. So it is really important to separate those two and to segregate them so that the Supreme Court, when they rule, if they say, yes, anything received after the deadline, unconstitutional, illegal, does not count, we know which ballots we're talking about.
And so say the Supreme Court, for example, does side with your challenge, the challenge by the Trump campaign. Would that just essentially say exactly what you just said, that all the votes that came in after November 3rd or whatever the Supreme Court decides is unconstitutional, those just get deducted from the grand totals that we see in these certain states? Is that how that would work?
Yes, those would not go toward the totals. That would include votes cast for President Trump as well. It's anything that does not meet that threshold criteria of being received by the deadline on Election Day.
And so when we're looking at a lot of these states, I mean, for example, President Trump had a commanding lead in Georgia. President Trump had a commanding lead in Pennsylvania. And now it's one of those situations where the Biden team is trying to really chip into those margins, really try to essentially come back from behind is what they're doing. Is it safe to assume that a lot of the votes that we've seen recently, a lot of them that are mail-in votes, a lot of those that are absentees, that those will be the ones that are deducted? Are they typically the ones that are counted last?
Well, so it matters what the challenge is to the votes, but what I think is the most interesting question here is why are we seeing in the midst of 2020, where I think the nation was very, very cognizant that we can vote early, we can request an absentee ballot, get it in timely, all of those things. If you want to make sure your vote counts, you get it in, and yet we're seeing so many that just happen to appear after the fact, and they just happen to break so much for Joe Biden. So that's why this is very suspicious and why we have to make sure to protect election integrity. If some of those ballots that were received after the deadline, if the Supreme Court determines that those are eligible and they're legal on whatever grounds that they decide, then those will be counted. But we have to make sure that the rules apply. I've been giving this analogy all the time, Alex. It's like you're at the end of the last game in the World Series, and there's the last pitch, and it would be like the umpire going, you know what, I'm going to risk offending one half of the ballpark over the other, team red versus team blue, so I'm just not even going to weigh in on this. No, the umpire's job is to fairly call the ball where it lands. But what the Biden camp and the Democrats have been trying to do is not have home plate, the strike zone. They've been trying to widen it by 100 feet just for them. That's illegal. It's against the rules. You can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. The umpire's job, like the judicial branch, is to make sure to call balls and strikes fairly.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like not too long ago we were talking about Amy Coney Barrett and her being a textualist, things of that nature. But I mean, it's not just about Amy Coney Barrett. That is literally the way that the legal system works. You read the law as it's written and then apply the facts as we're talking about right now. It's not necessarily making decisions based on that. I mean, it's a fascinating time to be involved in news, politics, anything like that. And to hear that it could be coming down to a court battle, I mean, it's going to be interesting over the coming days. Jenna Ellis, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program tonight and breaking down this complex issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm sure we'll talk soon. Thanks.